In some ways, I think this talk is meant to, I hope, spark some discussion. I can talk about some of the research I've done, but I think the bigger question is just how global change is playing out in the ocean, and how does that compare to what we're seeing on land? How similar or different is it, and how much can we transfer lessons from what we've seen on land into what's happening or going to happen in the oceans? So we know that things like pollution and climate change and overharvest and habitat transformation are really changing the natural world around us. And there's still some really important questions about what these large-scale changes mean for species, for communities, for the way that ecosystems functions, and also for what they mean for human society and the futures that are available to us going forward as the available natural resources change quite dramatically. But dip your head under the ocean surface, and I think it'd be very tempting to think that global change is playing out in very similar ways. This is where 90% of the habitable space on Earth exists, under the ocean surface. But we've given it much less attention. And I think there's some fascinating similarities and differences to what we see on land. At a really basic level, the diversity in the ocean is very different. So there's lower species diversity overall, but it's a much deeper diversity. We have 33 animal phyla shown here in the ocean. We only have 12 on land. It's a more shallow species diversity, but very rich at the tips. Life in a fluid is also very different. So it takes about 3 times as much energy to run a distance on land as it does to swim through water in the ocean, the equivalent distance. So dispersal is relatively easy in the ocean. The specific heat of water is also much higher. So it takes about 3 times as much energy to warm up a gram of water as it does to warm up a gram of soil. And that has very immediate consequences for how the oceans are responding to global warming. So this graph is showing surface temperatures on land, are the orange and red lines right here. And you can see that surface temperatures on land have warmed about more than a degree since 1850. Whereas in the ocean, they've only warmed about ½ a degree. So much less warming in the ocean over the last century and a half. So you'd think, okay, maybe we don't really need to worry about climate change in the ocean as much as we do on land. But on the other hand, species in the ocean are also adapted to much less temperature variability than they are on land. And these two graphs compare seasonal temperature variability on land and in the ocean. Each of these bars is the seasonal range of temperatures for a latitude. So we've got the South Pole, the equator, and then the North Pole on land and in the ocean. You can see that these bars, these seasonal temperature ranges, are much wider on land than they are in the ocean. So what that means is that even a small change in temperature in the ocean actually means a lot relative to an individual organism's experience, or even the experience of an evolutionary lineage and what a lineage has evolved to tolerate. Similarly, spatial gradients in temperature are much shallower in the ocean than they are on land. So you have to go about 150 kilometers in the ocean to see a ½ degree change in temperature, in surface temperature. Whereas you only have to go about 50 kilometers on land to see that same change. So it's relatively easy for, in the face of warming, for an animal on land to say, duck around the corner, duck around the other side of a mountain, say, and find a much cooler microclimate. Whereas for a similar species in the ocean, that equivalent temperature may be much farther away. So I think this raises some interesting questions about how these changes are playing out in these two ecosystems. But I think we have to think about how mechanisms work across scale. So a lot of, when species are actually responding to global change, responding to global warming, it's often individual species interactions at small time scales, local spatial scales, physiological processes that are important, but then that scale up to population dynamics, maybe shifts in individual species ranges, that then scale up even further to these large biogeographic changes, large changes in community assembly, or even macroecological patterns. And it's this kind of work across scales that my lab tries to tackle. So we do a work at local scales, primarily with population genomics and field ecology, to understand the ecological and evolutionary processes that drive meta-community and meta-population dynamics. A lot of this work is on coral reefs. And then we work with large-scale comparative data sets and meta-analyses to understand how these patterns scale up to, say, large-scale patterns like shifts in species distributions, changes in species abundance, and community assembly questions. It's really this large-scale work that I'll be talking about today, but happy to talk afterwards about some of the other work as well. So I've organized my talk around sort of the three main drivers of global change in the ocean. So climate, harvest, and habitat change. And I'm going to touch on each of these and then talk about how the changes that we're seeing compare to what we see on land. So to start first with climate. One of the most common responses to changing temperatures that have been observed are shifts in species distributions. So this is just one example. Each of these bars shows the range of a small mammal in some mountains in the western US. A paper by Craig Moritz in Science a few years ago. And in green, you can see that some distributions have expanded, either up or down, this elevational gradient on these mountains. Some have contracted here in red, and others just haven't moved much at all. And one of the, despite these sort of broad patterns that people talk about, species are moving towards the poles, species are moving up to higher elevations, or in the ocean, moving to deeper depths. There's an enormous amount of variability among species. So 50–60% of the species that we have records for are not following that general pattern. And even of those that are, some are moving a little bit, some are moving a lot. There's just a lot of variety. And there are lots of reasons that might be true. Might have to do with different physiological tolerances, species interactions, other environmental gradients, or details of species life history. All of that makes sense. Ecologists, we love to think about how much complexity there is in the world. But it's often led to the conclusion that these species responses are ultimately very idiosyncratic and very unpredictable. That it's going to be very hard to understand why an individual species is moving at the rate and in the direction that it is, because these systems are so complex. On the other hand, there's also this interesting idea out there that has been proposed of this idea called climate velocity that I think can be very useful for understanding how fast species are shifting. And the idea is that you have a gradient in temperature. For example, it's warmer at the equator, cooler at the poles, and if you pick a particular temperature, say 50 degrees Celsius, you could draw that line on a map, that isotherm. As this gradient warms, that isotherm is going to move, and then the direction and speed at which it moves is called climate velocity. And one of the interesting things is that in the ocean, climate velocities are actually very rapid. So even though temperatures aren't warming very quickly, I showed you that earlier, these thermal gradients are very shallow in the ocean. So you have to go a long distance before you can find an equivalently cool temperature after that gradient has warmed. So this is a figure from a paper by Mike Burrows a few years ago. So our climate velocities here on the vertical axis, again from the South Pole to the equator to the North Pole. In red, you can see climate velocities on land. These are latitudinal averages. And in the ocean, you can see that in some places, they're actually much faster than you see on land. Other places, they're about equivalent. This map shows climate velocities globally. You can see North America, Europe over here. Areas in white have climate velocities near zero. Areas in dark orange are climate velocities over 200 kilometers per decade. So there are a couple things to take away. One, climate velocities can be very rapid. This is over the last 50 years. And also there's a lot of variability from one place to the other. It's not a uniform pattern globally. And while we can map these physical changes, there's been much less understanding for what these changes mean for species and communities. And that was something that I was really interested in. And to try to test what climate velocities mean for species responses, ideally we'd have some sort of data set that covers a wide range of species across a large geographic area and goes far back in time. That would be the ideal. Hard to find, though it turns out in the ocean we actually have some data sets that are surprisingly good. These are data sets these are ecological surveys, they're scientific surveys, often conducted by government agencies. Many fisheries agencies here in Europe do these bottom trawl surveys around Europe. In North America, we have NOAA and Fisheries and Oceans in Canada that conduct them. They're originally designed for fisheries management, targeted at commercial species, but it's a stratified random design. They count in a way everything they pull up, which includes many fish, but also invertebrates and many species that are not exploited commercially. In addition to the cod and haddock and things that they're interested from a fisheries perspective. So one of the things that I've done, and folks in my lab have done as well, is pulled together these surveys from many different regions of North America and put them together in a common format so we can analyze them as one whole. So everything from Alaska up north down to the Gulf of Mexico, sort of a subtropical ecosystem, out to Newfoundland. And these data sets go back about 50 years. Some of them aren't quite that long. And to summarize sort of a lot of data analysis relatively succinctly, I'm going to show you an example just from the Northeast US. So Rutgers University is in New Jersey right down here, and then Maine is up here. This is actually where I grew up, and then Canada up here, just to give you some sense of where we're looking. And we can plot on this map the center of a species distribution. This is lobster in the late 1960s in this case. And then these surveys record how the center of that lobster distribution changed over the subsequent 50 years. And it moved northeast at about 70 kilometers per decade. Quite a rapid change, actually. On the other hand, this data set is good not just for looking at single species, but actually many species. So each of these orange arrows in this case is a different species in this data set. And you see, similar to that terrestrial example I showed you earlier, there's a lot of variety across species. Some moving north, some south, some not moving much at all. The average is this red arrow, about 20 kilometers per decade to the northeast. If we zoom out even farther, look at continental scale patterns, again, the colored arrows are individual species, and these black arrows now are the averages across all the species in a region. So in some of these regions, we see species moving towards the poles. Turns out this is often where papers have been published saying, look, species are moving towards the poles. But actually, an even more common pattern potentially is species moving the other way, actually towards the equator. Again, we see a lot of variety. So one of the first places we looked was just, okay, how have temperatures been changing in each of these regions over the time of these surveys? So here on the vertical axis is that community-wide average of whether species are moving north or south. And then on the horizontal axis, change in bottom temperature. Is it getting colder or is it getting warmer? And if you squint, like I tried to in the beginning, maybe you see some pattern. It seems like in some of these regions where it's warming, species are more likely to be moving north, and regions where it's cooling, they're more likely to be moving south. But there's also this really interesting outlier where in the Gulf of Mexico, it's been warming, but species are moving south. On the other hand, if you look at the geography of the Gulf of Mexico, if species were to move north in this geography, they would end up on land. Doesn't work very well for marine species. So in this case, they've actually been moving deeper towards cooler water. And in this geography, that's been the dominant trend. There may be other reasons that they're moving as well, but it's interesting. That lines up well with what we've seen in other regions. If you're willing to drop the Gulf of Mexico from this regression, we can explain about 60% of the variation across these different regions just based on how fast and in what direction temperature has been changing. Turns out we can explain changes in depth actually also very well. Again, in this case, about 80% of the variation across regions. So are they getting deeper or shallower? Here's the Gulf of Mexico getting deeper a bit. Again, related to how fast and in what direction temperature is changing. So these are sort of assemblage-wide average patterns. Seems like they're tracking trends in temperature. But a lot of that variability I showed you is actually what's happening to individual species. And that often seems like the hardest part to get at. So what is happening with these individual taxa? So to answer this question, we started looking at what are called thermal envelopes. So this is the range of temperatures within which species thrive. And they've been a useful way to think about physiological responses to temperature across a wide range of ectotherms, across a wide range of cold-blooded organisms, including lizards, but fish as well, and invertebrates. And so what we did was we used these surveys to define the thermal envelopes for the species that are caught, and then tracked through time how those thermal envelopes, not the species, this is just the temperature that are suitable for each species, moved through time. Did it move north, move south, and how fast? And then we compared that to data from the scientific surveys to understand whether species actually moved north or south and in what direction. So we had enough data to look at 325 different species. In this case, how fast the thermal envelope was shifting is on the x-axis, so is it moving south or north? And then this is what the species actually did. Did they move south or did they move north? So each of these dots is a species within a region. And you can see that in general, they're actually clustered right around this one-to-one line. That would be if they followed the climate velocity perfectly, which obviously they don't. There's a lot of interesting scatter around that. But we can explain close to 40% of the variation in this variability among taxa based on this one factor, climate velocity, which I think is really interesting. It suggests, yes, there's a lot of variability among species. We know this has been really tricky to understand. On the other hand, it seems like we can attribute a lot of this variability to this spatial mosaic of climate velocities. Differences in the spatial gradient in temperature and the rate at which temperature is changing at a local scale. On one level, it makes a lot of sense. Species are responding to their local conditions, but we haven't, up until now, really had the right metrics for measuring that in a way that is helpful. It raises another interesting question, though. Are species keeping up with climate velocities? Do they lag behind? And so the same figure can help us answer that question. Because the expectation here is that they should be moving north. Expectation here is that they should be moving south. Any species that fall down here are lagging behind, and you can measure the amount of lag as the difference between that one-to-one line and what they're actually doing. Similarly, lagging behind up here, and then in this case, these species are actually moving faster than we would have expected. So they're speeding ahead. Something else is going on. So if we just make a histogram of all of those differences for all those species, we've got speeding ahead over on the right, lagging behind on the left, we see that on average, marine species actually aren't lagging behind. They seem to be keeping up. Lots of interesting work to be done to understand what's going on out here on the tails, and that's some of the ongoing work that we're diving into now. But even this finding right here is interesting, because, especially in how it compares to what we see on land, because across a wide range of different kinds of taxa, from butterflies to birds to small mammals to trees and plants, it seems like many species on land are not keeping up with climate velocities, especially in places where climate velocities are especially rapid. And there may be many reasons for that. One, there are many fewer barriers to dispersal in the ocean. I mentioned earlier, dispersal is relatively more easy in the ocean as well. On land, dispersal is harder. It may be harder to move across space and colonize new territory in the same way. So it also, I think, raises an interesting question. In the ocean, if pure dispersal barriers are not preventing species from keeping up, what actually might impede their ability to colonize new territory? One thing might be fishing. So folks in my group, in my lab group, and then also some collaborators at Princeton when I was a postdoc, a couple graduate students, we got interested in the interaction between climate velocities and fishing. There's work done with Emma Fuller, who James has also worked with as well, and maybe you've heard about some of her work, and then Eleanor Brush, another PhD student at Princeton. And we wanted to start thinking about this interaction between fisheries and climate just with a really simple ecological model to a mathematical model to help us just build intuition. Like, what should we expect? Separate from what we actually observe, which is also an interesting question. So this very simple model imagines a population of fish in a one-dimensional world. It has a thermal envelope, which I'm representing here in red, where it can survive and reproduce, and then it is harvested by some fishery. This thermal habitat moves across space, and the question is, can this population keep up with it while it's being fished? For those who care about the mathematical details, it's an integral difference model with a harvest term added on top of that. We can summarize the math pretty simply. It's actually a nice model. We can solve it analytically in most cases, simulate it when we can't solve it analytically. But the basic result we can plot here, where we have increasing harvest rate on this vertical axis and increasing climate velocity on this horizontal axis. And what happens is we see that there's this curved boundary that separates two primary regions, where populations persist if they're down here, and they go extinct if they're up here. That makes a lot of sense. The interesting part is that there's this curved boundary, which implies actually that there's an interaction between harvest and climate velocity. And it says that for a given harvest rate, there's some maximum climate velocity that a population can keep up with before it goes extinct. But if it's harvested at a higher rate, then it can keep up with a slower climate velocity. So then we got interested in the question of, okay, how might we eliminate this interaction? How might we help species cope with these two stressors? One thing might be to implement a bunch of marine reserves along the coastline. So we could set aside a series of regions here in blue and say that there's no fishing allowed in there, make it disappear, and then compare, see what changes. So this is the base case right here. It's a very similar figure to what I just showed you. Again, harvest rate increasing here, climate velocity increasing here. Instead of just showing you that boundary though, I'm showing you actually equilibrium biomass. So high biomass down here and then extinct up there in black. So this is without marine reserves. Add in marine reserves and no surprise, you can withstand a higher harvest rate. That seems to make a lot of sense. But I don't know if you picked up on it, there was a very, I don't know what the right word is, a very helpful assumption I made in there, which is that all of the fishing effort within the marine reserves just goes away. Maybe a much more realistic assumption would be that it doesn't go away, it just moves somewhere else. And they start fishing outside the marine reserve. So if we instead displace harvest rate, so reality is probably actually in between these two end cases. Some people will leave fishing when marine reserves go in, but many people won't. But we're just going to look at the most extreme case where all fishing effort is displaced. In this case, I'll show you the same thing. Again, base case, but now with protected areas and this concentrated fishing effort between the marine reserves, you actually see species actually do worse when you implement marine reserves. So it's a relatively simple model, but I think the key takeaway message is that how humans react to these conservation measures and how they adapt to these changes ends up being a really important part of the problem. It's not just about species responding to climate, it's also about how humans react to these changes in the environment. We have to think about it as a coupled social ecological system. So, how do people react to shifting species distributions? I just want to show you a really simple, small story, though we're starting to expand this out to more case studies. This is one example from the Northeast US. It's a species called red hake. This is from 1968 to about 2010. We've got latitude here on the vertical axis, and the black line shows how the center of the species distribution from scientific surveys has moved north really rapidly. So we can also plot the center of where red hake has been landed by fisheries that catch red hake. And you can see that the red hake fishery has also moved north. Though there's also this more interesting pattern in there as well, which is that the fishery moved north at about the same rate as the species did up until about 1990, and then afterwards they've diverged. Red hake, the fish, has continued moving north up into Massachusetts, whereas the fishery has actually stayed farther south. And it turns out that there are a number of reasons for this. It turns out that the nets that are used to catch this species are actually excluded from many parts of northern New England where red hake are now common. And also there aren't many markets for selling red hake up there. It doesn't transport very well, and there aren't many processors for it, so it's hard to sell red hake even if a fisherman did catch it. The overall pattern is that the fishery is moving about 75% more slowly than the fish is. And that's something we've seen across a number of different fisheries that we've looked at, including summer flounder, American lobster, yellowtail flounder, 3 of the species that are moving north quite rapidly in the Northeast US. And as part of an interdisciplinary project we have now funded by the National Science Foundation, we're actually going out and working with a social geographer and an anthropologist. And we're actually going out and interviewing many of the fishermen involved in these fisheries to understand what their constraints are and what opportunities they see. Are they switching to new species? Are they trying to follow these species? Is climate important at all, or are they just responding to regulations? But I think we may be ending up with this interesting, actually, feedback between the response of the fishery and the response of the fish. Which is that if you think about a population right here being fished, as the population moves towards the poles, the fisheries ends up concentrating on the trailing edge, drives down the abundance at that trailing edge, but also sort of leads to a predator release at the leading edge. So the population can actually colonize new territory even faster at the leading edge than it would have if the fishery had kept up, which may actually end up looking like an amplified shift in species distribution, especially if you look at centers of biomass. So, but that's a social ecological feedback that would create that kind of process. That's one of the hypotheses we're now trying to test using a combination of these surveys and data on where people have been fishing and what they've been catching. So I think the take-home message from this part is that species are following climate velocities, and in the ocean they're not lagging behind at the moment, but it also sets up these interesting feedbacks. So to think about harvest, you'll notice that I've been treating all marine species as more or less the same, but there's a lot of variety in the traits of these different species. And I think there's this interesting question, really basic, in terms of what kinds of species actually are declining in the ocean. This is a question that's been answered a number of different ways and a number of different times on land, and the answer seems pretty straightforward. It's these slow-growing, long-lived top predators that are most likely to be at risk of extinction on land. You might say they have relatively slow life histories. And there are plenty of examples in the ocean that seem to match this expectation. Some of the large top predators like tunas and sharks, or some of the long-lived species as well, that have declined dramatically in recent years. But on the other hand, this hypothesis hadn't actually been tested across the broad range of species that are caught in the ocean and hadn't been tested at a global scale. So to try to answer this question, I looked at a database of stock assessments. So these are analyses that reconstruct population dynamics. They're put together by fisheries management agencies. We used data starting in the 1950s and looked at 120 different species, but about a little more than 200 populations. And we looked specifically at populations that had declined to very low abundance. So if you think about, population abundance has gone up and down. There's some level that's considered sustainable, the biomass that can support maximum sustainable yield. And then we considered it collapsed if it fell to 20% of that level. And I'm going to show you a number of graphs that look kind of like this. So just to orient you, this is the proportion of populations within a species that has collapsed. So each dot is a species. So this is relatively good. We don't know of any populations that have collapsed. This would be every population we know of has collapsed at some point in the last 50 years. And in this case, I'm showing you where in the food web they feed, herbivores or top predators. So among top predators, about 12% of populations have collapsed in this case. Among species low in the food chain, though, 25% have collapsed. It's actually the opposite of what we might have expected. In this particular case, it's not a significant difference. You can fit a generalized linear model at p-value of 0.15. So we can look at a bunch of other traits that we think might matter. So we could look at, and each of these is organized from the faster end of the life history on the left and the slower end on the right. And we could look at how long they live, no significant relationship. What age they mature, no. How much they weigh, no. Where I showed you trophic level before, and then growth rate. It's significant, but we've looked at a bunch of different possible predictors, so don't know necessarily whether to trust that one. But what's interesting is that in each of these cases, significant or not, the trend has been towards the faster end of the life history being more likely to collapse. On the other hand, we haven't looked at fishing pressure. We assume that a lot of these declines have been driven by fishing pressure. And it turns out when we include that in our model, it makes a big difference. That's probably no surprise. So relative fishing mortality is here on the x-axis. Anything over here on the right side has experienced overfishing, so fishing beyond the level that's considered sustainable. Turns out that's where we see lots of the collapses. On the other hand, again, fishing seems to be driving a lot of these declines. I think the story gets even more interesting, though, when we start thinking about the interaction between fishing and the traits of these species. So this is something I actually did with an undergrad. who ran boosted regression tree models. His name is David Byler. He was a finance engineer, but he was really interested in getting out of finance. It was fun working with him. And so we ran what are called boosted regression tree models, which are good at picking apart interactions between factors. And I'm going to show you one result right here from these models where we have growth rate here on the vertical axis, and then fishing pressure here on the horizontal axis. So those are two of the factors I showed you may be important. In blue, we see those stocks, and this is the prediction from the model, are the colors, the fit from the model. In blue, we see those stocks predicted to have a much higher probability of collapsing. And in white, low probability of collapsing. And what we see that's interesting is that at low fishing pressure, growth rate doesn't matter at all. At high fishing pressure, though, so for populations that experience overfishing, if they grow slowly, they have a slightly elevated risk of collapse. If they grow quickly, they have actually a quintupled risk of collapse relative to slow-growing species. So it's the interaction between how fast the species is growing and how hard they're being fished, implying that it's actually really hard to fish sustainably for these fast-growing species. But also is very different than what we see on land. So why are the oceans so different? Why are sort of the kinds of species affected by human impacts seem so different in the ocean than we see on land? So one possibility is because fisheries is a very actively managed, in many cases, at least not all, human activity. So yes, it might be that slow-growing species are more sensitive than fast-growing species to fishing pressure. But fisheries management actively tries to actively recommends a higher fishing mortality for fast-growing species and a lower fishing mortality for slow-growing species. That'll tend to actually even out the vulnerability across the life history spectrum. Add into that environmental variability. So fast-growing species respond quite quickly when the environment changes, either more productive or less productive. But our fisheries management system, this social system, responds quite slowly, absorbing information from the natural world, deciding, oh, the environment's less productive. Let's recommend lower fishing, lower quotas. So in that interim, as harvest slowly declines, but the population growth rates have declined quite quickly, it's very easy to drive these fast-growing species to collapse. That's one hypothesis, at least. It's very different than how human impacts on land interact with the range of species found on land. So habitat transformation, major impact on species extinction or probabilities of extinction on land, where it tends to primarily affect these large, wide-ranging top predators who are really affected by chopping up the habitat into smaller habitat patches. One of the other questions we became interested in is not only what kinds of species are declining, but are there genetic consequences? So just very briefly, we pulled together data on genetic diversity levels in each of these species, did paired comparisons between species that had collapsed and those that hadn't, looked at everything from tunas to herring to things like cod and snappers. And I'm going to show you results. The results are on this axis here, where species that had collapsed, that had lower genetic diversity are down here and higher genetic diversity over there. And what we saw is that in most cases, species that had collapsed in the ocean had lower diversity, about 10% lower, suggesting there are some at least mild genetic bottlenecks that are occurring, which actually is interesting because for species in the ocean with enormous population sizes, millions of individuals even in, say, a collapsed population of cod, that's very far from what the classic examples of a genetic bottleneck, where you often are talking about, say, dozens of individuals. So it implies that even though populations are very big in the ocean, there are these potentially even evolutionary consequences, reducing the range of evolutionary novelties that may be available for adaptation in the future going forward. So what we see in the ocean is that these fast species are more vulnerable, and there may be there seem to be these genetic consequences. For the last part of the talk, actually talking about habitat, I want to start actually very broad, just thinking about sort of how broad ecosystem loss of animals in the ocean has compared to loss of animals on land. And it becomes a story about habitat change. So we start out really broad. We know of 15 extinctions in the ocean. Everything from small limpets to giant stellar sea cows. But that's actually many fewer than the extinctions we know over the last 500 years on land, where we have about 500 extinctions on land that we know about. That's not to say, obviously, that populations haven't been dramatically impacted by human activities in the ocean. We know of many dramatic declines, even 99%. This is just one example for red snapper. And we also know there are some very important functional extinctions as well. Sea otters are not extinct, but when they're lost from a local ecosystem, they can lead to proliferation of urchins and loss of giant kelp, which then has cascading impacts on a wide range of other species for which kelp are very important habitat. But on the other hand, the number and extent of local extinctions in the ocean also seems to be lower. This was a comparison we made for, in green, we see the magnitude of range contraction for a number of different groups of animals on land, including mammals in North America and India, and birds and butterflies in Britain. You can see some very large contractions in some cases, which compared to much smaller contractions for many marine species, including large pelagic species and then demersal, sort of bottom-dwelling species around North America. Of those species at risk of extinction in the ocean, they tend to be those that come in contact with land at some point in their life cycle. Again, they come closer to humans, including sea turtles and marine mammals, birds, and reptiles. On the other hand, in gray, we see that, especially for marine fish and marine invertebrates, a lot of species we just don't know much about their status. This is from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, their assessment of extinction risks. It's also interesting to think about the timeline of human impacts in the ocean and on land. So human-caused extinctions that we know about on land started about 30,000 years ago when humans got to Australia, then spread to the Americas when humans got to America, and now in recent centuries it has spread globally. The human-caused extinctions we know in the ocean have been over just the last couple hundred years. And on land, we've seen this change from extinctions being caused by direct human exploitation, initially for subsistence, then an industrialized exploitation, and now habitat transformation really being the big driver. This is a graphic sort of illustrating that transition that we put together for a paper we published last year. In the ocean, even though human exploitation of marine species did start about 40,000 years ago, industrialized exploitation of whales, sort of large scale, started about 200 years ago. And then for a wide range of marine fish, didn't start until about the 1950s, after World War II. On the other hand, we are starting to see some initial signs that habitat transformation is becoming more common in the ocean. Loss of coral reefs has gone up quite dramatically, up to about 40% loss of coral cover globally, up to about 20% loss of mangroves globally, and then dead zones, so areas of very low oxygen, the number of dead zones has been increasing quite rapidly in recent years. And the drivers of these habitat transformations in the ocean are also increasing, including energy development, mining, which is just starting now, so these huge deep sea mining machines now becoming available, and also shipping traffic, which transforms the noise environment, especially important for many marine mammals. So I think one of the key questions is, are the oceans headed in the same direction that we've seen on land? In some ways they've been lagging behind the transformations we see on land. They've been protected by remoteness and inaccessibility, especially to human activities, but are we moving towards a future in the ocean where ocean habitats are also transformed at global scales in a similar way to what we've seen on land? I think the exciting part, though, is that we're at a point where we're not there yet. So the terrestrial Wild West might look like Los Angeles, like this, where habitat is completely transformed for human uses. But just go right offshore Los Angeles, jump off the pier, and you can see gray whales swimming around. You can see 300-pound giant sea bass. These ecosystems are still amazingly intact. So I think the key questions for us going forward is, can we use our understanding of how these systems work and our understanding of how transformation has happened on land to change the future of our interactions in the ocean? Can we bring science to bear on these big policy questions? From a scientific perspective, I think some of the key questions are how climate change interacts not just individual species, but entire species assemblages and the interactions between species, including with humans, with fisheries, and also how populations respond to loss of habitat. So this is work we're starting to address by looking at the demographic rates that allow metapopulations on coral reefs to persist through time, understand dispersal between populations as well as growth rates, using population genomics and field work. So with that, I guess my final point is that we have very similar ecological and evolutionary processes that operate in both these ecosystems, but some very different patterns that fall out when you think about how humans interact with them. And I have a lot of people to thank, some wonderful collaborators and students that I've been able to work with, the folks who fund all of this work, and thank you all for listening.